So welcome everyone to our roundtable on the price of everything, debt, work, sleep, as part of the Department of Political Science Speakers Series at the University of Alberta. So thank you for coming.
So first off, thanks to David for organizing today's talk and to my fellow panelists. When I was working on my last book, Downward Mobility, The Form of Capital in the Sentimental Novel, I had really clarifying conversations with my political science colleagues, Cressida and David, separately. And so I'm really excited to be sharing this space with them today. So my contribution as sort of the English person on the panel is first going to introduce financialization as a concept briefly, and then trying to think about the way that literature and history helps us understand and grapple with what critical finance studies calls the financialization of everyday life. So the financialization of daily life is a phrase that comes from a 2002 book by Randy Martin. And what we refer to when we refer to financialization is the way that the financial industry, financial calculations, risk-bearing financial instruments, in general, constitute an increasing part of our everyday life. So the expansion of the industry around financialization. Most estimates place financial services sector at around 20 to 25% of the world economy. And just to give you a sense of the difference, the expansion of financialization, 10% of Americans owned stock in the 1950s. Today, 56% in 2021, which is down a little bit from 2008 after the crash. So many of us are implicated in speculative capital in many ways, whether that's through mutual funds, through pensions, insurance, real estate. The majority of Americans are implicated. And those left out are left out in more ways than one. They're not just poor, but disenfranchised from equity, and therefore going further into debt every day. So we know that one of the effects of neoliberalism has been to download risk onto individuals. And this includes risk managing our own financial lives. So we're increasingly called upon to make rational financial calculations. And just last week, I went down the rabbit hole of deregulated electricity rates in Alberta. It's not pretty. And without the expertise and time to do the research, we tend to default to the lowest number. But it's easy to see how that lowest number hides the real cost, right? Environmental, social, cultural, of the price of everything. So we default to the cheapest individually often, but who's keeping track of the price of everything, of that collective price? So the growth of financialization, or what I call the dominance of financial thinking, has been to replace narrative with numbers as the primary mode for understanding and calculating value. Right? Financialized thinking has taken hold of our imagination in a way where we can't even imagine how we might speak back to that. And how every value is turned into a metric or a number. I was reminded of this recently. Some of you will be familiar with this graph when our provost at the university circulated it as a kind of rationalized restructuring of our administrative breakdown and the cutbacks to academic leadership positions, associate chairs in our faculty, and it's fully rationalized, and it all makes sense. This many students equals this much, this many academic leaders. But of course, the stories behind these numbers get lost. And how do you rhetorically fight back? So it presents an entirely rationalized system when the story on the ground is so very different. The replacing of narratives with numbers can be traced back to the 18th century. Its genealogy lies in that expansionist logic built into imperial capital. It's been a commonplace to look at the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century as feeding the wheels of commerce but the Industrial Revolution depended upon the previous one, what we call the Financial Revolution of the late 17th and early 19th century. So the Financial Revolution sort of built the financial infrastructure that allowed capital to launch its productive imperial cycle in the 18th and 19th century. We mainly see it as the introduction of paper credit and financial instruments. So the founding of the Bank of England in 1694, the beginning of the stock market at Lloyd's of London, insurance, and then the bills of exchange, bonds, mortgages, and all of this provided the liquidity of global trade, including, of course, the trade in human lives, the slave trade. And many of you will be familiar with the infamous case of the Zong via Dion Brand, where Africans were murdered by slave traders who then turned around and claimed those dead bodies as financial losses on an insurance claim. So it's the introduction of speculative capital so that the insurance can turn human bodies into numbers, into commodities. So we can see one of the effects of the financial revolution in the 18th century in the discursive divide separating literature from economics. So the beginning of economics as a discipline that's separate from and divorced from political philosophy. I don't know how often Adam Smith is taught in political science still, but clearly he's primarily a political philosopher, though people assume he's an economist, and those two don't fit together easily anymore. When interdisciplinary work has brought literary scholars in dialogue with political scientists and sociologists and anthropologists, the dialogue between economists and literary scholars has not been particularly fruitful or ongoing. And mostly economists see their methodologies as more at home in mathematics departments than in arts. And there's an increasing emphasis on complex statistical modeling with bigger and bigger data sets. But this increase is fundamentally revolves around a forgetting that economists produce models, i.e. acts of the imagination. They begin with an as if. And this kind of forgetting of what underlies those numbers is part of a lot of financialized thinking. Historical and cultural research then aims to remember, of course. Faced with the reduction of all thought to that kind of numerical metrics, we insist upon the stories behind the numbers, of attaching human narratives, right? And I was reminded about this last week. I went to the Art Gallery of Alberta, and there were two fabulous Indigenous artworks, both of which involved remembering through individualizing in art portraits of children from residential schools. So George Littlechild's and Adrian Stimson's exhibits both include portraits of each child at a residential school, and a residential school that their parents, their family members went to. So the kind of bringing it down to that individual relation and individual story. Okay, so one way that literary studies engages financialization is to remember the history that lies in language, the words we tell, etymology. And what we see is that so many of the words of our financial culture actually come from words that did not originally have that financial or numerical meaning. Of course, economics itself is a Greek word for the task of managing a household. So before it meant, finance and numbers, it meant how we take care of each other, how we manage to live together. Accounting originates more in a spiritual term, accounting for oneself, than it does, a department or a form of math. So the financialization has made these dead metaphors, right? They've taken out the human behind those terms, and then recirculated them in a way where we can't remember those. So I was thinking about this. Someone, I think it might have been something about the University of Lethbridge strike, where someone mentioned that students invest in their education, therefore, right, they shouldn't be out on strike. And so this idea that education is an investment of an individual, we almost literally mean it in dollars and cents, right? It's like they pay a lot for tuition, so they should get something out of it. But it's forgetting. It's the way that those sorts of language seep into so many other parts of our understanding. I want to think a little bit about fictitious capital, fictions of capital, because it increasingly defines a temporality in which we live. It's central to kind of thinking about the financialization of everyday life. So fictitious capital, of course, is a term from Marx. The term he used to refer to wealth generated through speculative exchange, buying something in order to sell it for more money, or as Marx said, for the money breeding money. So the way capital circulates under highly financialized economies is increasingly free from production. And so we saw this divorce between the world of making and buying material things and stock market in the historic highs that were recorded in the stock market at the same time as the historic highs of COVID deaths were happening. So there was a total split between what the reality of what the world was experiencing and then how the stock market was responding. So, and one of the ways that financialization works then is to circulate more and more abstract derivatives and that generate wealth on these kind of contractual chimeras of time. And so that it's hard to imagine an outside of it. And of course, we all remember the famous Frederick Jameson quote, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism." That certainly feels the case these days. But this is precisely an effect of the financialization vortex, right? We have this imaginative vortex that traps us inside its logic of financialized metrics. And so the rise of populism, or the truckers who truly believe that vaccines are not working. How do we respond? And it's frustrating, but we also have to understand it as a symptom of a cultural logic that refuses the slow and complicated work of interpretation, of making meaningful connections between things. In his research on the cultures of financialization, I'm just going to end with this quote. Max Havin explicitly opposes fictitious capital to narrative, arguing that financialization is both a cause and a consequence of a broad shift away from narrative. Financialization forces us to contend with a fragmentary world where narratives no longer seem to hold, and where shared understandings of social and economic processes are increasingly disjunctive and chaotic. So this is why it's important to insist upon and develop the skills at making the connections, making meaningful connections, which is narrative. So to me, literature's answers not only lie in the content, in remembering stories, but in its form. The modes of thought that reading complex narrative demands It trains us to go beyond the fast outrage, to string together often contradictory ideas in meaningful ways, and to refuse the financialized habit of mind in which the numbers speak for themselves. Okay, I'm going to stop my remarks there.
Okay, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be involved in this. I'm actually going to pick up on some of the themes that Katherine raised, because I want to just talk about this again, the concept of financialization that Katherine has so nicely introduced to us as the replacement of numbers. Think about the relation between numbers and narration. And I'm going to just sort of describe one sort of tension or puzzle that sort of animates my thinking about the concept of financialization over the last number of years, my research, my writing, and even the way I've been teaching it. And that's a tension that exists between, on one hand, the idea of financialization as a kind of expansive logic, the notion that financialization entails a kind of expansion or injection or colonization of increasingly numerous sort of political and social domains by financial practices or financial interests, financial metaphors, as Katherine says, the dead metaphors of finance. So I'm interested in the tension between that notion of financialization and the limits of financialization, thinking about where and what might be the limits of this logic of financialization. And so I'm just going to give you a couple of examples on one hand of why this kind of logic of financialization as an expansive force, I think, is intriguing and politically salient, before I move on to considering questions about the tensions between that notion and the notion of its limits. So as Katherine has kind of explored here, the idea of financialization, like a broad term, nonetheless trains our attention to the ways in which financial practices or the logic of financial measurement and calculation, financial interests have become more dominant and shape our social, political, and cultural worlds at various different levels and scales. Again, to refer to Randy Martin as well, who notes that financialization entails a machine for living whose architecture is at once international and intimate. And I find this notion of financialization politically useful in a number of different ways. I'm going to give a couple of examples of the ways in which I've been thinking about and working with this notion of financialization. On one hand, and again, as Katherine has mentioned, there's a notion of financialization that I'm partial to in some ways, that refers to the capitalization of almost everything, so a reference to Lation and Thrift, who point us to the ways in which to live in financial times, as this Financial Times ad indicates, is to live in a moment when financial institutions are constantly prospecting for financial value, for trying to find new forms of income streams that can be converted into assets that can then be circulated among global investors. So this constant prospecting, often in social, cultural, everyday spaces and objects and bodies, some of which have been distant from the financial world, and to convert those spaces into forms of financial value and to build assets around that can be circulated among global investors. And this has entailed attention then to all variety of places and sites where this financialization has occurred, from education to healthcare, and many other everyday sites as well. But I think the most important place where this work has become resonant is around the question of debt. So to live in financial times is to live in a world where increasingly more and more of us are indebted in unique and burdensome ways, in ways that generate inequality and fragility and precariousness. And at the same time, to live in financial times is also to live in a world where that debt then becomes raw material for the global financial markets, becomes the foundation for new forms of assets available to global investors. So this asset building really centers around debt of all kinds. And I'm thinking here about the ways in which this has intensified since the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. So the intensification of asset building around everyday forms of debt and many other kinds of debt. So I'm not talking here just about sort of public debt, but also payday lending debt, debt related to credit cards, microcredit receivables, and of course, and maybe especially student loan debt, and the ways in which that debt and the burdens connected to it become the basic foundation for new forms of asset, new asset classes in the global economy. This is what Andrew Ross refers to as a kind of creditocracy. So on one hand, I'm interested in that expansive logic of financialization in relation to this sort of asset building process. But there's other dimensions of financialization in the expansive sense of that financialization that are also, I think, politically important. And I think this refers also to something that Katherine implied as well. And that's the extension of the metaphors, the language, the modes of measurement associated with the financial world into new non-financial domains. And again, we've seen countless examples of the injection of financial metaphors, languages, and practices into a range of domains and spaces, ranging from education to healthcare to law and many other areas besides. But I've become interested over the last 2 or 3 years in climate and the ways in which financialization is becoming a key, if not the most important way in which climate uncertainty is being governed. What we're looking at here is a map from a kind of infamous investor presentation produced by ExxonMobil in 2014, in which they tried to communicate to their investors that they could render climate uncertainty and climate futures calculable, in which they could understand climate uncertainty as a calculable, predictable, knowable, and manageable future, a future, in short, that could be financialized. And here, of course, we're seeing a replacement and a reduction of, if I can use Katherine's terms here, of narratives to numbers. And this is just one example of the ways in which we're seeing a kind of increasing financialization of climate, the incorporation of the financial logic into the governance of climate. So I'm thinking here of all varieties of climate insurance, of catastrophe and green bonds, of weather futures and hurricane derivatives, and so on. And so this is another example, and there are many other examples, of course, of the ways in which this framing of financialization as an expansive logic, I think, is politically resonant. And I've used this in my own work in many ways. My own work recently has focused on the very edges of financialization. So I'm very interested in how financial institutions address those who are at or beyond their reach, how financial institutions address the unbanked or the underbanked, how they address communities that are beyond their reach. And I think this notion of financialization framed as a kind of expansive logic also has allowed me to think as well about the ways in which financialization often entails the refiguring, the reordering of space and time, and some of the ways that Katherine's already prefigured. So in terms of space, and I'm thinking about, again, my own work situated at the very edges of financialization. I'm doing a project now, for example, that relates to a microinsurance project in sub-Saharan Africa, an attempt to mitigate the uncertainties that smallholder farmers face in relation to climate change by building a little insurance contract around that uncertainty, selling that insurance contract to reinsurers who then pass those insurance contracts off to global investors. So thinking about the geography of financialization that's accomplished in that kind of moment. On the flip side, however, I'm also interested in the places of abandonment, the geographies that are abandoned by a process of financialization. This sort of expansive logic of financialization also, I think, allows us to think about the reordering of time. I mean, you can think as well about the time as a risk, a way of thinking about time in the future as a manageable, knowable object that can be predicted and rendered fungible, and so on. But there's also other renderings of time, or reorderings of time connected to financialization. Just to mention one that's been interesting me lately comes from Lisa Aitken's work on the time of money and what she describes as the evisceration of time associated with debt. So to be indebted over the long term in a financialized moment often is to carry debt debt in a way that she argues results in prepossessed and preset futures. So despite, however, of the enormous contributions and political resonance that notion, that framing of financialization as an expansive logic allows us, I'm also worried about, I have some worries about that framing in particular. And I worry that, especially as it's used by some in the political economy and science and technology studies dimensions of financialization, that it can present finance as a kind of implacable, overly coherent, and maybe even inexorable kind of force. So to take a quote from two commentators who note that financialization is, quote, an ongoing and violent tendency of finance to penetrate and subsume economic activity and social life as a whole. Almost anything, they say, can be turned into an asset given the right technical and economic configuration. But what worries me about that kind of framing is that it leaves little space to think about the limits of financialization. So I'm interested in questions about what and where are the limits of this logic of financialization. There's lots of different ways we might think about the limits. I'm just going to mention two in the few minutes that I have left here. On one hand, I've been thinking a bit about the ways in which financial practices often generate their own incoherences, their own disruptions, their own interruptions. So I've been writing recently, for example, about stranded assets, which are kind of in ways, an inversion of the ExxonMobil map we're looking at here. Stranded assets are assets like a gas and oil reserve, for example, that have been assigned financial value, that have been assigned a number, but whose value dissipates before their formal point of maturity. And so there's lots of really interesting but politically urgent incoherences connected just with that example of the limits of financialization. But I'm also interested in more explicitly political limitations or limits to financialization. And I'm thinking here in particular about the political ways in which financialization have been subjected to political disruption, to contestation, and to refusal. So I'm just going to conclude with a few minutes thinking about the politics of refusing finance and disrupting and contesting finance. What we're looking at here is a poster for the Rolling Jubilee, an example that many of you might be familiar with. It's an experiment in financial self-help connected to and growing out of Occupy Wall Street, in which artists and activists and their constituencies raised money in order to buy distressed debt so that they could cancel that debt. They initially intervened in markets with relating to bad medical debt and then turned to student loan debt. It's an example that I've written about, but also one that's been quite well known. And it's one that I think signaled in the post-crisis, post-Occupy Wall Street moment, a kind of renewed energy in terms of thinking about politicizing and organizing around debt. So this unleashed a larger kind of thinking about debt and how that could be politicized and refused. So thinking about organizing around debt, around debtors' unions, around debt strikes, around mutual self-help, and many other experiments around debt and debt analysis. It also led to a revitalization of traditions of debt audits, the ways in which especially public debt can be scrutinized by citizen participants in relation to notions of odious debt and illegitimate debt and so on. So I've been reading and thinking a lot about the case of Puerto Rico, which has been experiencing its own unique financial crisis since 2015, although with a much longer historical context. And it's a crisis and a form of public debt that's been scrutinized by a citizen public debt audit, which has tried to contest the language of financialization, and maybe, to borrow Katherine's term, to give a narration back to an episode that's governed by numbers, and numbers that, in fact, in some ways favor international financial agents. But I think political action, political contestation, political refusals around financialization have actually broadened even more so since over the last decade, since Occupy Wall Street and since the period of the financial crisis. And so I've been thinking about, and Katherine's presentation kind of prefigures this as well. I've been thinking about the work of artists as well, who've been increasingly turning to finance and financial topics, and in particular, reminding us of the materiality of finance and financialization. So, for example, I've written recently and been thinking about Ireland's ghost estates. The ghost estates, as many of you probably know, are the half-constructed housing developments that were, on one hand, a part of the enormous value that were enfolded into the bubble in Ireland before the financial crisis, but that were left basically frozen mid-construction when that financial crisis crested. And these ghost estates are many things, but one of the things they become is a kind of site of political and artistic intervention in which artists have tried to rework these ghost estates as a kind of physical remainder of financialization in the crisis itself. And I think there's a kind of important political resonance around that kind of materialization of finance, to materialize a world that we often associate with the placeless, with the virtual, and with the immaterial. So I've been thinking about those political possibilities. And this takes me, and this is sort of a word of conclusion, to the kind of realm of housing. And I'm just giving you an inventory here of the ways in which I've been thinking about the political limits of finance and financialization. And I think over the last year or so, it sort of has become apparent to me that housing might be one of the most resonant sites where we can think about both the logic of financialization in expansive terms, but also in terms that might allow us to make visible its limits. So I'll just say a quick word here about housing as a way to conclude. As many of you know, of course, housing was central to the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, especially through the securitization of subprime mortgages, which were the source of enormous value for global investors, but also triggered the instability that resulted in the crisis and in the recession that followed. And yet it might be the post-crisis moment that gives us the most interesting and telling story about housing and financialization. In the post-crisis, in the decade and a half since the crisis, housing has become, again, refinancialized, so that what followed in the wake of the financial crisis, especially in the American context, was an enormous wave of foreclosures and evictions. So millions of foreclosures and evictions that allowed investors to accumulate distressed housing assets at a fraction of their face value. And those investors often began to convert those housing units from owner-occupied houses to rental units in a way that, of course, flooded the housing market, to put enormous pressure on rental markets in housing prices and affordable housing opportunities in large cities, first in the American context and then around the world. But these investors also have managed, of course, to take the income stream that those rental units and the rental payments project over the long term and convert them once again into securities and into assets for global investors. So instead, what we're seeing here in the housing sector is a kind of story of financialization and crisis and then refinancialization, but also, and finally, a story of contestation as well. Because this wave of refinancialization, this attempt to extract financial value from those houses that were eventually at one point expelled from the financial system during the crisis, has been met with a whole range of creative forms of political action and contestation and around the world. So I'm thinking here in particular of a whole new wave of movements committed to squatting and occupation, but in particular, movements committed to anti-eviction politics, politics that attempt to disrupt, to postpone, and to interrupt eviction. So again, we could think about the temporal frame there, about postponement as a certain kind of short-term conceptions of time, but a strategy is designed to inject and interrupt the financialization that has led to these evictions. I'm thinking in particular of the anti-eviction movements in Chicago and Los Angeles, and the ways in which those movements themselves have been informed by and influenced by housing activism and anti-eviction activism in the Western Cape in South Africa, and by housing activist movements in large Indian cities, especially Mumbai and Calcutta and Delhi. So in this kind of frame of the housing, I'm thinking of a case that might reveal to us once again the tension that exists between financialization as a logic of expansion, but also alongside, and hopefully, the the possibilities of some of its political limitations. And I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Rob. And finally, handing over to Cressida.
Thanks very much. It's such a great pleasure to be able to share the stage with two colleagues whose work I think is really amazing, fantastically good. So I'm excited about this conversation. It came out of, sorry, I'm trying to do two things at once. It came out of a department meeting, actually, that Rob and I were both in, where Rob, we have a little thing called Teacher's Corner, where someone speaks about their teaching for 5 minutes. And Rob had said something about teaching the politics of money and how much students appear to enjoy talking about money and work in particular. And I teach a course called The Politics of Sleep that includes a big unit on work. And I have also noticed how millennial Gen Z age people really get a lot out of conversations about work that might seem a bit abstracted or not, for whatever reason, like far away from their experience, but they're not at all. And so I think that there's a lot of everyday politics that's really of great interest to a lot of people in these issues. I mean, just the numbers on who owns financial instruments is really stock, is, among other things, is just really incredible to me. So when we talk about debt, which is one of our key terms here, I'm going to go in a slightly different direction and talk a little bit about my work on sleep. So I start from the phrase money never sleeps. And you'll see here all of my sort of social media. I'm not very good at social media, but I am trying to sort of cultivate a popular conversation about the politics of sleep under this tagline, sleep is the new sex. So that's where you can find me. You can buy, if you want, this illuminated neon sign to put over your bed that says money never sleeps. I haven't. But of course, it's the title of the sequel to Wall Street. So it's a Oliver Stone movie from 2010. It got panned. But of course, this movie appeared on the heels of the financial crisis. And this aphorism, money never sleeps, is in a way just another way of talking about fictitious capital, that, as Katherine referred to it. And so money acts even when we are not acting on it, is what we are supposed to take away from this, I think. But sleep sleeps, right? This is one of the problems with sleep, is it's resolutely determined to do what it does. Nonetheless, we do have the concept of sleep debt, which is one of these fascinating terms that recurs throughout discussions of sleep medicine. And yet, I've suggested here it might be a zombie idea. Everybody says of sleep debt, you can't think of sleep using the language of debt because it's incoherent, right? You actually cannot spend, save, invest, sleep for interesting reasons. So we shouldn't talk about sleep debt, but it then proceeds to do it, which I find interesting and why I think it might be a zombie idea, which is, of course, this phrase coined by the economist Paul Krugman as a proposition that has been thoroughly refuted by analysis and evidence and should be dead, but won't stay dead because it serves a political purpose, appeals to prejudices, or both. So the term sleep debt refers to accumulated lack of sleep. So if you become, over the short or the long term, chronically sleep deprived, you have a sleep debt. And here's a graphic that's based on common sense advice, really, from Harvard Medical School that exemplifies what I mean about the zombie idea, right? That this is refuted at the same time as it's deployed. So if I'm in sleep debt, I've borrowed wakefulness in the present, but I'll have to pay with sleep in the future. So I'm borrowing from my future self, right? If I get into sleep debt, I can't, it's not, it can't be reassigned. Like in her book, Katherine talks about debt being assignable. So sleep debt can't be assigned because it must be mine. It keeps, sleep accrues to me or is owed by me, and it can't be given to someone else, which I think is kind of an interesting limit to the logic of financialization, which is nonetheless applied to sleep. So both money and sleep entail practices of the self. And I think that this is a big link between my work and Rob's work. So there are ways of engaging financial and soporific activities that make you into the kind of person you are, especially ethically. So there's tons of stuff about this. Here's a slide. I'm sure you've all seen versions of this where you're invited to clean up your sleep hygiene. So lots and lots of rules to follow in terms of being a good sleeper, and how, many of which are kind of dependent on all sorts of material conditions that may not apply to you, but nonetheless it's highly individualized. The language of sleep is also very moralizing in ways that I think are connected to the way that debt is moralized, which is something that Katherine talks about through her analysis of narrative. So here's one that really pissed me off. Sorry, now I've said something sweary that you'll have to edit out. We've got the idea that if you are a night owl or a lark, and here it's even worse because it's referencing the early bird catches the worm as a kind of moralizing phrase, that your chronotype or your sleep practices determine something about the kind of moral character you have or the kind of personality. And I've picked this one from my extensive archive of weird sleep slides because it has this very strange thing in the middle where it suggests that if you're both, I think that's the best thing to be. So if you both go to bed late and get up early, then you have the most virtuous character of all. So in my book, Anesthetics of Existence, Essays on Experience at the Edge, which came out in 2020, I draw in the title on Foucault's phrase, an aesthetics of existence. The title is based on the fact that I went to a conference and I was very tired. And I thought someone who was giving a paper about aesthetics of existence was actually saying anesthetics of existence. So I started to think about what that could mean in the context of sleep. And what Foucault means by the aesthetics of existence is making yourself in the manner that one might make a work of art, which seems very tiring. So anesthetics of existence in my book is the kind of dropped calls of the self. It's the ways that we check out in various ways of a kind of stream of agential consciousness that's assumed to define the self, at least in Western cultures and especially in political theory. So sleep has some confounding features, and in this book I say a little bit about that. Sleeping entails giving up on your agency and giving up on control over yourself. It's kind of uncanny, sleep, because I continue to exist, I'm not dead, but I can no longer consciously direct my own subjectivity. So sleep is an interesting example, I think, of the limits of some of these logics of financialization. And people get very exercised about the fact that sleep, which takes up so much time, is not productive and doesn't make money. It's not work. Although, of course, there is lots of research aimed at looking at how work and sleep interface with each other. So when Rob talked about prospecting for value, I thought, yeah, this is exactly what I'm interested in. This is a part of the project I haven't done much on, so I'm curious what you think about this. There are lots of ways that people in various fields are trying to think of how to extract value from sleep, if I can put it that way. One of them is the idea that you can use sleep time for problem solving, that you can lucid dream, that's a big feature of this research, or that you can otherwise program yourself by having certain thoughts or doing certain ritual practices before you go to sleep or while you're in your hypnagogic phase to make sleep into a productive, useful process so that you wake up having achieved something. Another way that sleep is rendered productive or enters into this kind of logic of value is through sleep apps. So there are a huge number of sleep apps. It's a really big part of the quantified self movement, thinking about sleep. So here's just a screenshot from one of many. But you can get an enormous amount of data about your sleep. And that in itself, I think, is designed to make you rethink your practices of the self that are organized around sleep in a way that's like the sleep hygiene rules slide, but through this language of quantification. And then finally, sleep is being gamified. So Pokemon announced 3 years ago that they intended to launch one of these everyday life apps like Pokemon Go or Pokemon Smile, which is a toothbrushing app, where they would attempt to make sleep valuable, right? You could be playing while you slept. It was never clear, because it was never fully marketed, what this would mean. But my son, who's 13, actually saw this slide and said to me, oh, this is obviously for parents, that they will sell their kids on sleep by saying it's Pokemon, right? Like maybe you get a Pokemon if you go to sleep by a certain time or something like that, which I thought was canny, right? Like that probably is how it's going to work. So sleep is very individualized in all of these examples. It becomes my personal responsibility in the way that debt is often represented as my personal responsibility. But Rob's work shows us that, in fact, debt is not, doesn't have to be individual. It can be assigned in negative ways. It can be moved around. It can be sold to someone else. But it can also be understood as a collective problem that merits collective solutions. So what if we reversed the primacy of sleep? What if instead sleep getting in the way of me? What if sleep is sleeping me? So what if instead of thinking about, I am a self that exists prior to sleep, and sleep is an interruption of that self, we think of periods when we're asleep as being just as real, or maybe more real, in terms of who we are. That's a bit of the kind of idea that a philosopher would like, but you can find it in this very quirky little indie book by the disability rights activist Johanna Hedver, who talks about just this, where she writes that I wrote most of this book, maybe all of it, maybe all of my books, in my sleep. She talks about the value of sleep to her work. It's not coincidental that she's chronically ill, and she spends a lot of time sleeping and also a lot of time in bed. And I've just finished writing a paper about being in bed and all the things that people do in bed, including working, including thinking in bed. So I go to my desk, I don't speak so that they might continue to the dreams that she has. You must understand it's not my sleep, it's that I belong to it. So her work, I think, is an interesting way of kind of resisting this understanding of sleep as existing at the frontiers of value extraction and reversing the relationship. More obvious is an example I've talked about elsewhere, which is this is a project called Black Power Naps by artists Nabil da Costa and Fanny Sosa. And it's both a participatory experiential piece of art and a kind of installation. And what they're hoping to achieve is to establish spaces where rest is represented but also experienced. And a lot of the artists' statements around Black Power Naps ask provocative questions about what do you do to enable Black people to rest? What do you do in your life to mobilize rest for others? So instead of how do you make other people more productive, or how do you motivate your workforce, right? These kinds of questions that are about how you make others more active, they turn it around and they ask, how do you create spaces where other people can rest, right? So that's a more, and they represent it. So that's a more collective kind of understanding of what it would mean to resist some of this maybe financialization of sleep, but certainly this attempt to push beyond the limits of where work happens, of where value can be extracted from human activity. So I'll just end with that as an example of a biopolitical refusal, which was in the abstract, I think, for this panel, and suggest that this biopolitical refusal invites a comparison with downward mobility, with debt forgiveness, and ultimately with degrowth, which I think is something, although we haven't mentioned that word, that all of us are tacitly interested in.
Thank you, Cressida. Anything you want to say to one another?
Well, I'll maybe start off by thanking both Rob and Cressida, and I thought the order was really interesting because we kind of went from the big picture to Rob's analysis, and Cressida, you took some of the dead metaphors into a whole different area. Um, and I want to underscore the importance of Rob's thinking about the limits of financialization and how we need to think outside that logic. And Cressida, you've offered us some interesting ways of doing that. I wonder, Rob, if you could speak more about the climate example you gave of the insurance and the crop and the microfinancing of that, because what strikes me in it is there's a small collective who's trying to manage their financial lives and comes together to help each other out in some ways, but then it's when that's the assification, when that's turned into the asset that's then sold and resold, that is it. Would you see that that's the moment of financialization, or is it in the original moment of the ground, the work on the ground?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think you're right too. I mean, that's a good term. A bit clumsy too, is the assetization. But I think the moment it's a good one. I think the moment where it turns into an asset, that introduces distance and it severs it. So there's a kind of a way we might think of alienation there as well, when that uncertainty becomes removed and removed to a reinsurer or to a and eventually ultimately to global investors who may only own a small piece of that actual risk. So it's like risk, it's like aggregated and disaggregated again, and so on. What's interesting is that some of those insurance schemes build on, however, like long-standing kinds of ways of managing uncertainty that have a long resonance in some of those communities. So like there have been attempts to tap into like community solidarity mechanisms, the same way in which like microfinance often makes use of like very informal credit, like rotating credit sharing mechanisms, and so on, that have been practiced in one way or another for generations. So I think there's a way of obviously in which those uncertainties are managed collectively in a way that's like very productive and generative. And so what's interesting is in the attempt by financial institutions to alienate some of that and to remove it, and what can actually be extracted. So yeah, I would say there is I guess the point is that the point where it becomes an asset that can be removed from its context, severed from its original context, and therefore its meaning then becomes, as you say, one of just numbers, and that whole the narrative around it, the narrative of mutual self-help or of whatever other element of community support that might have initially had smallholders work together has been lost, and what's just left is this contract that can be bought and sold. Let's think a bit more about that, but that's a useful way to think, like, at what point does that become financialized, and what point does it represent like a meaningful and creative, resonant way to manage uncertainty? I was going to, Cressida, I was going to ask you something as well, if I can. Sure, I mean, I was really interested in this, the like unique, you said, confounding notion of agency connected to sleep. And so could you say a bit more about that in terms of like, and to what extent are these like sleep interventions and like interventions around sleep hygiene and so on, would you see them as attempts to cultivate a technology of the self? And in what ways are they like deviations from that? Because they involve this kind of letting, what kind of technology is that if it's not a sort of conventional way of understanding a technology or practice of the self?
Yeah. I mean, that's partly what Anesthetics of Existence was about, was trying to think about technologies of the self that don't deploy the same understanding of the self in quite deep ways. So one of them is a big concept that I was working with is agency, and I think in philosophy there's a lot of talk about agency, and it's insufficiently anthropological mostly. Like, it sort of reifies and idealizes what it is to have agency, as if it's a real fetish, So I say some of that. but something about agency that I think a lot of us assume, even if we're savvy to that, and that sort of fetishization of, I control the world and I can do all these things with my agency, right? Like, we don't think that, but we do sort of think of agency as somehow continuous. And so the interruptions of sleep, where you're clearly giving up your agency, but returning to some version of it, is actually a very profound challenge, I think, to what we think it is to be a subject in quite deep ways. And so, yes, I think that sleep is a technology of the self, but it's a technology of the self where instead of an aesthetics of existence, you're deploying an anesthetics of existence. And that's really contradictory and makes us, I think, have to think quite differently about what it is to be a subject, in ways that some disciplines I think are already quite far ahead on, but philosophy and political theory are really bad at that kind of thinking. So yeah, it's sort of hard, like there's a lot. I mean, I haven't said anything about dreams, and there's a lot of literature about dreaming. Like, are dreams the unconscious represented to you? Are they wish fulfillment? Are they, like, lots of different kinds of theories about what dreaming achieves, but in the quantified self movement, or in the sort of the gamification, or the giving value to sleep literature, dreams have to be about problem solving. They can't just be about having a weird fantastical experience of flying with some other pigs, like they have to be somehow useful to you because something is achieved. So I think that their attempt to bring agency back into sleep, like I might be out of control, I'm unconscious and my mind is doing all these wild things, but if I set it up just right, I'll wake up with something checked off my to-do list, And so I kind of want to point that out about some of these technologies, because I think it's revealing about how we think about agency locally, but technologies of the self more broadly.
I really liked your observation that of the unassignability of debt, that you actually can't turn it into an asset in the same way that Rob and I were talking about, because somebody else can't sleep for you. And there's something about that. It's a kind of material negativity in a way that that brings us back to the embodiment.
It's a tangible frustration too. In some of the transhumanist literature, like sort of, subreddits, where people are sort of just like, damn sleep, it won't do what I want it to do, right? It's like there's a real frontier there that's intensely frustrating. There are definitely people who, if they could get someone else to sleep for them, would do it in a heartbeat. Yeah.
I have an observation and a question about the limits of financialization in the recent kind of horrific moment of Putin's war, and that is that the West has taken this strategy of using financialization, right, against Russia, and barring them from SWIFT, and taking all these financial measures. But are we seeing in some ways, Rob, the limits of financialization in a terrible, horrific example, because it doesn't seem to be doing anything,
Yeah, so that's an interesting observation. Do you mean in the sense that it hasn't provoked the pressure you thought it might, or in the sense that, one of the limits of that whole strategy seemed to be our mutual entanglement in those very mechanisms? And so would introducing an interruption to the Russian financial side also impose pain on us as well? Like, so it's hard.
Right.
I'm not sure. I think there is a sense that the mutual entanglement has been an obstacle to actually using that as a mechanism.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to suggest we turn to some very rich questions that have been posed, and I'm sure you'll keep on talking to each other as well. Omar asks, Are there ways or examples of how to subvert financialization that do not involve the use or retooling of current financial methods? Examples given around Occupy Wall Street with buying debt still use the debt tools of banks, but in a subversive way. Can we think of a life outside of capitalism if capital's tools are the method of our emancipation? And there was a related question from QC, so I'll read it out as well and come in as you wish. It was directed especially at Rob. I was wondering what you think about formations of resistance that use financialization against itself. Here I'm thinking specifically about Wall Street Bets, the Reddit forum that was able to leverage its following to attack institutional investors who were shorting GameStop while getting rich at the same time and being unapologetic about it. How would you conceptualize this form of resistance in your work? So anyone who wants to come in on either of those angles, feel free.
Maybe I could say something quick, and then I'd be really interested, Katherine, in how you respond to that question. But I guess, like, when I was thinking and doing a bit of work on that Occupy experiment, I was interested in the actual inverse of the question. So I was actually interested in the ways in which, though it was a form of political action, often organized by artists, like artists were central to that mechanism, in which they tried to sort of insert themselves in the interior spaces of finance. Like they had to learn about what secondary debt, like what distressed debt markets were. They had to figure out how to buy debt in that market, which meant that they had to understand the legality of doing that and the logistics of actually canceling debt and so on. So it meant, and they had help. Like I interviewed a number of people who mentioned, like, anonymous Wall Street lawyers and others who had helped them. But for the most part, they did this themselves. Like one of the key organizers, who was an artist, had to go and meet a debt buyer and learn about how to operate within those spaces. So what interested me about that example was precisely that this wasn't like the typical counter move resistance model. This was so where a position from outside of the system is used to attack it. It was like inserting themselves within and trying to like see how malleable the logic of the financial markets were and learning about those markets so they could operate within them. So I was interested in like the generative possibilities there because in my field anyways, like in kind of forms of critical political economy, the metaphors of resistance are all kind of, as I said, kind of like a move, counter move logic. And so I was interested in exploring something more subtle and complex and in that sense. So I actually was trying to think about the political resonance of that kind of move in that sense. I know, Katherine, if you have any thoughts about where that would come from, either inside or outside, and so on.
Yeah, you've answered it the way I would. And certainly I think that Wall Street likes to keep people out by making people think it's too complex. Yeah. And so that was an instant where people used education and financial education to organize back. And I think that's an important part of it. I would, and I think some of the microcredit stuff that you've written about, Rob, is a case of not using more mutual aid society tools than financialized tools. The GameStop example is a really good one because, of course, everyone jumped and said, "Oh, this is like democracy in the making," right? It's like bullshit. No, it was just another Ponzi scheme. It was just created by white men on Reddit rather than white men on Wall Street. So I don't think that GameStop is an example of a kind of democratic crowdsourced fighting back Wall Street.
I've really enjoyed all of your presentations. Katherine, thank you so much for showing the atomization and the financialization of what's happening here in the institution. I think that might be something to be talking about even more. And we're all sharing this horrific experience. So it was really nice to see that, even if it was encapsulated in one tiny little slide. My question that I had sort of put in was really a comment. And I was reflecting on sort of what both Rob and Cressida were talking about. And so this idea of a debt, sleep debt, which I certainly feel like I'm experiencing, having been dealing with insomnia, and I have a kid who's actually going to be sent off to the sleep clinic to figure out whether she's on some kind of weird circadian rhythm or whether it's just her own fault for being on screen too much, or she slumps too badly, or she's got bad posture, whatever it is that's causing her not to be able to get to sleep. But it actually has interrupted her willingness to work because her workplace would not provide her with an accommodation to not show up to work before 10 o'clock in the morning. And so she's actually leaving that job. And so it's very serious, this concept of sleep debt. And then I was thinking about what Rob was talking about when you talk about the debt jubilee that was happening with the, and then I thought, well, what would a sleep debt jubilee look like? Right. And so then that led me to, my first thought is like, oh my God, a vacation where we could actually sleep. Except as Cressida pointed out, that because sleep has to be productive, and if you think about what people are doing on vacations now, I don't think those all-inclusive things where you have to make zero decisions except whether to drink or eat something, and all you do is hang out and do nothing. I don't think those are as popular as, the going on the self-improvement yoga retreat or the big long trek, or where you walk the Camino, or where you learn to cook, or there's all these vacations, or you volunteer and collect data as a citizen scientist. The vacations aren't actually doing nothing anymore, so they're not opportunities to get a lot of sleep. So what would a sleep debt jubilee really look like?
I love that question.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. A sleep debt jubilee. Well, I think it has to come from restructuring work practices and, sort of chronological practices more broadly. I mean, there are ongoing, never resolved debates about why we insist that children in secondary school start school at 8 or 8:30 in the morning, when there's so much evidence that teenagers are on a owl. They're the owls, and that this is actually really, really bad. It's difficult to make kids do it, but it's also not best for health. And why couldn't we start secondary school at 10 o'clock? Well, the answer is that parents want their kids to go to school at the same time that they go to work. Why can't you get an accommodation to start work at 10 in the morning? Well, because the employer wants people to work on a particular time, right, on a schedule. There is interesting writing about how the vastly increased number of people working from home during COVID has made some employers more relaxed about schedule, right? Because you can't micromanage the time of your employees as closely if they are working from home, and yet nothing catastrophic seems to have happened to productivity. So there are some openings there, but of course they're counterbalanced by bossware, right? So people who are using spyware to surveil what their employees do at home and so on. So I'm not sure that sort of looking to rational arguments about productivity is going to lead to a sleep debt jubilee. I think it has more to do with labor organizing and with trying to sort of increase the power that people have to not overwork, but also to manage their time in various ways. And it has everything to do with the gig economy, the lack of affordable childcare, right? I mean, there's so many factors that play into that, and all you can do is sort of pull at various threads, I think. But I do find Black Power Naps provocative as a project, because it's really made me think, what do I do to support other people's rest? And I think anybody in any kind of leadership position or position of authority could keep asking themselves that question. And there are things that we can do as teachers, things that we can do as institutional leaders, things that whatever, where it's like, really, what are you doing to create spaces of rest for others that are not about, another technology of the self that will somehow improve you or increase your productivity. And it's very difficult to get people out of that way of thinking. But I do think that there's value as a thought experiment and little strategies that we can deploy too. But I'd like to think more about that just as a bigger, kind of more robust question.
Thanks.
because, you know, Rob, you would know I do a lot of work on climate policy, and one of the big areas is the what I call the creation of fictitious commodities like carbon offsets and payments for ecosystem services of various kinds. And these have turned out to be a complete disaster ecologically and have done very little good for anyone in terms of social justice either, right? And yeah, these are the tools that have been picked up by the neoclassical economists as, you know, things that are going to the market solution to the climate crisis. And it's really powerful because, you know, you can't turn in any direction without hearing this argument. I'm just at the moment looking through a large swath of presentations in the parliamentary subcommittee that's looking into the cap on greenhouse gas emissions. And, you know, there are the usual presentations from all the business associations and the fossil fuel associations, corporations and the energy economists and so on. And they're all, you know, referring to market in various ways to provide the solution. And then, so anyway, this, you know, I think the work on the financialization of the environment, you know, is really important to do. And there is, I mean, we're looking at pushback, right? So the pushback, there's a huge pushback from the global south, from organizations in the global south to this, because they see it as different forms of land grabs and different, you know, new forms of colonialism. And so that's a very powerful critique that's been offered of the financialization of environmental commodities. I was also kind of struck by the fact that you all use terms like finance capital, fictitious capital, assetization, but nobody talked about commodities and commodification. And there's this interesting shift from, you know, talking about commodification, and I think what, you know, offsets are a form of commodification of something that was just invented, right, to create a new market in the trade of supposedly not emitted carbon. Okay. But then we have this different phase, which is financialization, and I think that there's a significant distinction to be made between those concepts. But anyway, I'm going to stop and I'm going to go on about that. I did put a comment in about I forgot what it was now. Sorry, it was in response to, oh yeah, it was what Cressida said about degrowth. I'm one of those degrowth advocates, and I'm finding it extraordinarily difficult to make any progress whatsoever on trying to insert this as an idea into climate policy discussions, right? Because the last thing that any economist, most economists, dare I say, you know, want to hear is fundamental assumptions being contradicted or challenged in the whole discipline. You know, do we need economic growth? Do we need to have an export-based economy? What is all this extraction for? You know, like these kinds of questions, they literally look at you like you have two heads. Stop there.
And you're right, we haven't been talking about commodities. I think in part because the language of commodity evokes the kind of materiality. And so yes, it's, you know, we've turned everything into a commodity, but that commodity is an asset, and its status as a financial instrument that we're interested in, rather than its status as an avocado or carbon or all the various things that the infinite things that we can turn into assets.
Katherine, for both you and Lori, I'm just curious how you would respond though. So like, is there a distinction to be made around the notion that an asset is, you know, has this unique kind of like temporal dimension, that it's really about a claim on returns over a long-term future, as opposed to a commodity, you know, where the value is exchanged at its moment of exchange? Is that I mean, it seems to me that that might be really worthwhile distinction to make.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely, and the temporality of it is so that you're, in fact, you're buying and selling time, not, you know, the thing itself. And this idea that we can risk manage everything has this deadening of the future, right? We can control the future, we can manage the future, we can buy and sell it and take out all of its risks. But you know, being alive is a risk.
Thank you, Cressida, and I froze for a moment but are back. There are still some really wonderful questions. I'm going to throw in one of my own, which is, like Lori, I was really fascinated to see your slide, Katherine, of this traumatic image from the restructuring of the university. And I'm just really curious whether there's more to be said about what's not totally on the surface about how the university, maybe the University of Alberta in particular, is being financialized, and what strategies of resistance might look like. And Cressida, I think that invites us to think about sleep and wake and work, as well as what might, the economic side of financialization. But does anyone want to come in on that?
Well, I can start by saying, when the new budget model came out a couple of years ago, and we had amount of research dollars brought in from external sources as a metric, I kind of like it was a real indication to me that the kind of financial logic has taken over, and it's partly because it's a question of scale. How do you compare a university as big as ours? How do you compare research without turning it into numbers, right? And so I think, I think it's happening everywhere, and resistance is in getting together and talking and trying to bring the story back into it.
Thank you.
Can I just add to that one of the key sites now contesting financialization on campus is divestment from Fox.
Yes, I was going to talk about that. Sorry, go.
Yeah, cool. Maybe sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Maybe you've got. I just want to raise that as like obviously we've seen like these enormous gains in some American campuses, and here of course it's been a different story. So I'm just curious if anyone had any thoughts on divestment as a flip side of or a way of contesting financialization here on campus.
I was actually interested in that before this panel, and I looked up the university budget because some of you, I was a faculty member on the board of governors, and I was on the subcommittee on finance. And so I was curious about how much of our budget comes from investment income. And I had a sense that it was a large portion, but it's actually not. It's only like 0.6% of the total university budget comes from investments that are dividends from those investments. But the investment committee of the board, so the people who make the decisions about where that money is going to be invested, is one of the few committees on the board that does not allow faculty or student or NASA representation. Now, one of our professor emeritus on campus, David Cooper, who's the Marxist accountant, got the board to institute, it was one of his real contributions, institute an investment policy. So they have an ethical investment policy. But as Rob's pointed out, there's limits to that. So ethical investments still include oil and gas. And so the kind of divestment organization on campus is trying to get a divestment of oil and gas is, I think, a great movement. I think that it's kind of dead in the water on this campus, but like, let's get the conversation going and maybe it will become possible.
Thank you. We're quite close to end of time, but Cressida, I wonder if you have any thoughts on what resistance looks like in the context of what you were speaking to us in the context of our university.
Well, I mean, yes and no, right? I mean, I think that, well, I mean, I just think Katherine's right, really, that reintroducing stories is really important because they have been stripped away. I mean, the particular numbers that you put up were taken from that academic leadership document, I think. And what that is saying is that because X number of students and Y number of, I can't remember what all the metrics are, right? But are implicated in this department or that department, that this is the number of people in administrative leadership positions who are required in each of these roles. But one of the things that I've been doing is just constantly, obnoxiously sending people job descriptions, like, this is the job description of what it is to be associate chair of graduate studies. And these are the things that need to get done. Why do you think that 2 course releases, which cost about $20,000 or a little less, are bad value for that job description, which is a financialization, but it's a financialization with a story, right? Like, this is the story of the work that people in these roles do. And you can't reduce that to, some numbers that are not indexed to that work, because the work doesn't reduce to the number of people that you're surrounded by, right? It is to do with all sorts of things, like who has a crisis that week, or whether there is actually anybody in the role of this other admin position who's supporting it. So there are so many factors to it. But it is a metric. Like, a job description is a way of saying, here are the tasks that need to get done. But it's not solely based on numbers. It has a story behind it about the things that people do. So, I think that's been a completely futile gesture. But I think that sort of thing is really important. The university does it themselves. If you look on the main website, there's always a "Have you met?" feature. And then they tell you a story about somebody who does a job. And I often look at that and think, why aren't we doing that? Like, have you met X who was fired? What she used to do was blah, 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 right? So, yeah, I think about this, but I'm not very, very good at it, I'm afraid.
I love that idea, Cressida. And I think that the more agitprop and the way that we can materialize, like what happened to sit-ins, has COVID and the virtual world made them a thing of the past? I don't think so. Like materializing, embodying some of these things, it's important.
Thank you all. Thank you, Katherine, Rob, and Cressida. This has been a wonderful conversation.